So, Franklin D. Roosevelt becomes the 32nd President of the United States. This is Cool Talk. In my last video, I mentioned how he got polio, and I can't stress enough the willpower of this man who never stopped trying to walk. He was in his early 50s and had been doing therapy for 12 years. He continued this until the week he died. It was excruciating to walk down a driveway using a cane and holding on to someone's arm. He hid his paralysis. He wore his braces under his clothes that often cut into his skin and caused considerable pain. Now, his incompatibility with his wife Eleanor and his infidelity tore the happy couple apart. But Eleanor did gain her voice and often traveled the country for him. She was his eyes and ears. She was not content to be a typical first lady. She was active. She wrote a newspaper column, held press conferences, visited hospitals, veterans, orphans, African Americans, Native Americans, coal miners, and often got Franklin D. Roosevelt to help the downtrodden based on her first-hand experience, and he encouraged this. Of course, the country was still in a depression, millions were out of work, and Roosevelt knew that continuing Hoover's plan to balance the budget and help the people was impossible, so he started a whirlwind of activity. The key was to get the banks working again. He had the banks closed for 5 days as they researched to see which ones were sound. Then he gave radio chats and connected with the people, making them partners in his quest to restoring the country's economy. It was the New Deal. Once he assured the people by radio that it was safe to deposit their money, the people did so and replenished the banks with cash. His system was to try something, anything. If it didn't work, try something else. It was a bunch of work programs, and they were called alphabet soup because of all the acronyms involved. For example, the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, which employed young men to work landscaping and preserving the natural resources. The NRA, National Industrial Recovery Act, has set minimum wage, set hours, and the minimum work age. The Supreme Court later said that the NRA was unconstitutional. The PWA, Public Works Administration, put people to work building dams and hospitals. The AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act, was to help farmers by paying them subsidies not to grow too much food. This was very unpopular because hungry people wondered why food was kept from growing, or worse, destroyed along with livestock just to keep the prices up. Roosevelt was big on hydroelectricity and created the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, a huge project that covered 7 states, bringing electricity to millions. It is still the largest utility in the United States today. There was a CWA, Civilian Works Administration, work projects that also enhanced the arts. The FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that protected the banks. The NLRB, National Labor Relations Board. The FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. The SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, to regulate the stock market. But probably the biggest program that Roosevelt began and which affects all of us today is the SSA, the Social Security Administration, a retirement program for senior citizens. It still resonates today, and many of us can count on it to supplement our old age expenses. Now, how did the country pay for all of this? Well, gone were the talks of balancing the budget. The country was borrowing from the future to finance its present. Financially unwise? Maybe, but hugely popular and helped millions. You see, people were already talking revolution during the Depression. Unions were springing up everywhere. There was talks of communism and revolution. We had people like John Reed, Eugene O'Neill, Emma Goldson, Louise Bryant. It was a hard, terrible time, very difficult, and I guess you could say that Roosevelt was buying time. Now, the rich hated Roosevelt. They considered him a traitor to his class. They wouldn't even use his name, referring to him as that man in the White House. When World War I veterans marched on Washington, D.C. again, rather than sending in troops to chase them away, as Hoover did, he sent his wife Eleanor to talk to them. Roosevelt refused to send troops to break up strikes. 1936, Roosevelt was easily re-elected. But while Roosevelt struggled with the Depression, Adolf Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany. and he had already opened the first concentration camp in Dachau. Non-Nazi meetings were outlawed, and Germany made alliances with Japan and Italy. So Japan invaded China, and Italy invaded Ethiopia. Many Europeans fled from the war in Europe, including one Albert Einstein. Back to Roosevelt and the Depression. Roosevelt repealed Prohibition. It was legal to drink alcohol again, and of course, Roosevelt taxed the alcohol companies. During his second term, the chocolate chip cookie was invented. The film King Kong premiered. Gangsters Bonnie and Clyde were gunned down. Jesse Owens broke 3 track records in the Olympics in Germany. Howard Hughes broke the speed record and flew across the country in 7.5 hours. Now, Roosevelt got a little too full of himself. When the Supreme Court deemed that some of the New Deal programs were unconstitutional, he tried to reorganize the Supreme Court, filling it with judges who approved his programs. The country was horrified. This seemed like dictatorial powers, and Roosevelt had to step back. And he took the blame. People called him a dictator, but the Depression was far from over. In fact, when he tried to cut spending, unemployment went up again. It was a severe recession. And during his second term, well, the first blood bank was opened in Chicago. Amelia Earhart disappeared over the Pacific. The Grapes of Wrath was published. Cooperstown in New York opened the first National Baseball Hall of Fame, and it was the premiere of movies like Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. Hattie McDaniel was the first African American to win an Oscar, and Booker T. Washington was the first African American to come out on a stamp. 24-year-old John F. Kennedy wrote Why England Slept. A young actor named Ronald Reagan starred in Knute Rockne, All-American. McDonald's opened its first restaurant. And, for that matter, so did Dairy Queen. It was also the introduction of a new funny character named Bugs Bunny. But in Europe and Asia, the war continued. The Japanese killed 250,000 Chinese in Nanking. Hitler had invaded Poland. Then he invaded Austria. He had also opened the concentration camp Auschwitz. All in all, the Holocaust would kill over 10 million people. 6 million of them were Jews. Hitler had also made an alliance with the Soviet Union. They had agreed to divide Eastern Europe, so the Soviet Union invaded Finland. The Germans then attacked Norway, then Denmark, then Brussels, then France. Roosevelt feared that this alliance between Germany and Joseph Stalin of Soviet Union, Mussolini of Italy, and Tojo of Japan, what could this mean for Western civilization? The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, it seemed like he was fighting alone. He begged Roosevelt for help, but the American people did not want to get involved. It had been only 20 years since World War I, and the sight of veterans missing limbs and struggling was all too obvious. People felt that World War I accomplished nothing. And of course, there was Charlie Chaplin, who was ridiculing Hitler on the movie The Great Dictator. But this was no laughing matter. It was 1940. Time for another presidential election, and Roosevelt had decided to run for a third term. Republican candidate Wendell Willkie said that if he won, he would keep the United States out of Europe and out of Asia and out of war. Winston Churchill begged Roosevelt to help him out, but Roosevelt was kind of in a bind. He couldn't send weapons, couldn't do anything, not until he won that election. Well, Roosevelt won. The only president to be elected for a third term. And though he promised he would keep the United States out of war, less than a year later Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States was now involved in World War II. What would Roosevelt do? We'll have to wait and see in my next video with Franklin D. Roosevelt and World War II. In the meantime, this is Cool Talk. Comments below and subscribe.